very excited to be here, to see all these really happy, smiling, not sleepy faces, right? I'm sleepy. It's really, really good to be here. I love coming to Belmont Abbey, and especially love walking through old buildings. That is such a blessing to be able to do that for 4 years. When I was in college, that was one of my favorite things, is old, stinky buildings that you just get to walk around in. It's really beautiful. So, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of time to kind of ask some questions and think about them. Where I went to college, St. John's, after lectures, they would have what are called question periods, not question and answer periods. You don't always have an answer to those questions. Sometimes it's good to just wrestle with the question. So I like calling them that, question periods. So hopefully we'll have some time for that. But myth as medicine. Fairies are real. So are ogres and goblins. Trolls do live under bridges, and there are old giants who live in the mountains and dark creatures deep in the forest. We've known about them for a very long time. We've written stories about them, told tales around the fire, and painted pictures of them and composed music. We know how real they are because of the impact that they've had on humans as a whole. Man is a truth seeker. He has always sought to find out what everything really is, what it really means. Man goes out into the world and wonders at it, tries to understand how things work, where they came from, why they are there. And time again, these curious oddities called mythical creatures keep popping up. Why is this? I've never seen a unicorn or a dragon with my own eyes. I've never seen a fairy light up a forest, nor have I been accosted by a troll on a bridge. I know I look like I have. Nor has a sphinx given me a riddle. And yet, that's not really the issue. The real question isn't, why do I say these things are real when I've never experienced them? The real question is, why do I understand them when I've never seen them? In other words, the concept of a dragon or a goblin or a wizard or any fairy tale creature doesn't perturb me in the least. I have no problem wrapping my mind around them. I can describe what they look like to you. I can tell you what they sound like, how they behave, anything like that. I know for a fact that dragons seek to hoard gold, and that fairies are beautiful but mischievous. I know that goblins live in caves, and that unicorns are found in the open field one arrives at once they've made the dark and perilous journey through the forest. If these creatures aren't real, why do I understand them so plainly? In fact, why do they even seem to understand me? If they aren't real, why are so many of us afraid of the dark, afraid of what lurks in the depths of the forest undergrowth, but we're comforted by a warm fire at night and the companionship of fireflies, or lightning bugs in the south? I believe that this strange familiarity we all seem to have with these otherwise completely foreign creatures is a testament to the very reality in which we and they participate. In other words, mythical creatures and fairy tales prove that the world is filled with spirit. A long time ago, before we were all convinced that we knew everything, we saw the world for what it truly is, a place that was teeming with life, both physical and spiritual. The two were not disconnected. Today, we tend to think of the world, and especially humans, as dualistic, mind and body. This is wrong. Descartes describes this in his work, that man is made up of mind and body. The mind being the intellect, and the body being that about which was intellected. The world, the res extensa, I think is the Latin, was intelligible only insofar as it was capable of being intellected upon by the mind. Yet this is further removed from the truth that our ancient forebears knew. The human is body and soul. The intellect is that which resides in the soul, a part of the soul's faculty for approaching the true good and beautiful. The ancients saw the soul as the animating force of not just the human person, but of all things. It was the spiritual world that permeated the physical and brought movement and life. Aristotle writes in both the physics and the metaphysics about the idea of a prime mover, a being who brings into motion all things without himself being moved. Even here, we see the deep connection between the physical world and the spiritual, a kind of movement that brings forth physical life, but is divine in character. It's not just in philosophy that we see this prevalence of the spiritual realm. Throughout the world, man has written about and interacted with the spiritual world. The Greek myths of the Cyclops and the Minotaur, Ovid's stories of the Metamorphoses. There's a Native American tale about the possum who stole fire from the witch to give to humans, and that's why their tails are bald, because they caught the fire. All of these stories touch on man's desire and innate ability to see the connection between the spiritual world and the physical. It was second nature in some ways to perceive reality as having a divine touch. However, something changed. It's beyond the scope of this talk, but throughout history, particularly in the age of the Enlightenment, ironically, mankind fundamentally changed the way that we view the world. Rather than seeing the spiritual realm as coexisting with the physical realm, or even more accurately, as the foundation of the physical world, we see the world as merely physical. And if we admit of the spiritual world, we understand it only analogously to the physical. The operative principle in the modern age is that the world is mechanical, not mythical. For us, the world is something that the mind apprehends, almost violently. We do not see the world as something to contemplate, but something to conquer. The world is physical, with an emphasis on physics. We try to understand the rules, the structures that provide the order in which physical things operate. Thus, thought becomes neurons firing in the brain. The movement and forces of the world operate to cosmic laws. The human brain is understood as a kind of computer. Just think about that for a second, how ridiculous that is. The thing that invented computers is thought of as a computer. Ones and zeros are the stuff we think about. But the ancients had, this is going to sound a little sentimental, but the ancients had a more enchanted view of the world. For them, the stars were angels and fallen heroes. Flowers and trees used to be people who underwent terrible things or beautiful victories. Certain places were dangerous because there be monsters there. Now, I don't intend to suggest that the modern emphasis on physics is totally wrong. No, the ancients were just as interested in how the world worked, perhaps even more than us. Their scientific achievements and understanding were admirable and noteworthy. The difference between them and us is that they didn't stop there. They didn't stop at scientific data. They knew to keep going, that the physical world was connected to the divine. This is why Ptolemy and the medievals called theology the queen of the sciences. Theology, or philosophy, was the foundation upon which all of the sciences rested, and this was the project of Socrates particularly. While some of the thinkers of his day were interested only in explaining the phenomena of the universe or focusing on political power, Socrates dared to ask the question, how should I live? Virtue, ultimately, is the aim of philosophical pursuit, not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. Have you all read Plato, right? A little bit? Good. Without returning to a more complete vision of the world, as the ancients and medieval saw it, we will be destined to view the world as merely mechanical, to see people as animals, and to see life as a process of birth, decay, and death. But the world is far more wonderful than this, and fully capable of supporting a vision where life is spiritually more fulfilling. We need to see the world not as mechanical, but as mythical. How do we do this? We live in a mechanical world. How do we return to this more mythical one? This is where fairy tales and myths can help us to re-enchant the world. To do this, we must first learn a little bit more about why fairy tales, what they are and why they are important. This is what Tolkien has to say. It's in his essay on fairy stories. Quote, "The definition of a fairy story, what it is or what it should be, does not then depend on any definition or historical count of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole." End quote. He's such a good writer, isn't he? Those sentences. But this touches on what I was saying at the beginning. The idea of fairies is something that intersects with our world, participates in it, but is not entirely the same. It is inextricably linked with ours, and thus something to which we must attend. Tolkien goes on to say, quote, "For the moment, I will say only this. A fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its main purpose may be, satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic. But it is a magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. There is one proviso. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself. That must, in that story, be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. Of this seriousness, the medieval Sir Gawain in the Green Knight is an admirable example. End quote. Again, what Tolkien beautifully points out is the importance of taking these fairy elements seriously. In other words, we ought not to denigrate the spiritual in favor of the physical. To say something like, mythical tales are fun and all, but they aren't real, is supremely presumptuous statement to make. It's the kind of thinking that leads one to getting tricked by fairies or torn to pieces by an ogre. But more importantly, the needs for these kinds of stories is vital. The art of myths, fairy tales, and fables is lost in our mechanical modern world. However, there have been some bright lights in the last century, reawakening our desire for these kinds of stories. Tolkien was a deep lover of these stories. So was George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis, and a lot of others you could probably think of. Lewis, in particular, wrote many of his stories as fairy tales, precisely because of the way they conveyed truth. Lewis writes about the fairy tale form, saying, quote, its brevity, its severe restraint on description, its flexible traditionalism, its inflexible hostility to all analysis, digression, reflections. I wrote fairy tales because the fairy tale seemed the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. The beauty of the form of the fairy story allows us to delve deeper into our own reality by exploring the extraordinary, the supernatural, and the otherworldly. Although on the surface, the magic of the fairy world seems other to us, it is in fact a kind of mirror that allows us to see ourselves more clearly and deeply. We can see this particularly well in the epic poems of Homer. Have you guys all read Homer? Good. If you didn't, bad. While some of what appears in the Iliad and the Odyssey seems completely outlandish, Achilles fighting the river god, Odysseus blinding the Cyclops, Homer always connects the stories of his poems to our world through the use of his epic similes. In Book 4 of the Iliad, Homer describes the Achaeans moving out to battle. Just as thundering ocean surf crashes on the sand, wave after wave driven by the west wind's power, one wave rising at sea, then booming down on shore, arching in crests and crashing down among the rocks, spewing salt foam. So then Danaan ranks, row after row, moved out, spirits firmly set on war. Oh, that is good. There's another one. Oh my gosh, I'm just going to add this really quick. He describes the Achaean soldiers moving out of the tents. They're coming out like crazy, and he describes it as like a swarm of bees. Like if you hit like a beehive and the bees go crazy, and the soldiers coming out like that. Ew, it's so good. Anyways, this beautiful imagery, constant throughout both the Iliad and the Odyssey, highlights Homer's deep understanding of the power of story to illuminate and drive truth. By giving us these similes throughout, he reinforces the connection between our world and the world he's presenting to us. It's the same world, even though there's some elements that are slightly other. The apparent otherworldliness of his stories is not an excuse to dismiss them or make them unapproachable. Rather, by connecting certain actions and events within the narrative to our world by use of these similes, he makes the world of the Battle of Troy and the journey of Odysseus even more understandable to us, enchanting our world with the beauty of these myths. It is here, though, that I would like to present a warning. We have to be careful not to confuse the aims of fairy stories and myths with just any kind of fictional literature. Telling a wondrous story about some fantasy world, you might think of examples today of what I'm talking about, but I won't name them explicitly. Telling a wondrous story about some fantasy world does not necessarily mean that one has written a fairy story of this kind. Instead, there is the very real possibility that the author has actually done the opposite. The purpose of these fairy stories is to give us a mirror, a kind of story that deepens our understanding of our own world. However, some fictional stories do not present themselves as mirrors, but actually as windows. They offer an alternative reality, a world that is completely other and different to our own, often more exciting and more wild than ours. These stories are a kind of escapism, making us believe, often unconsciously, that our own world is inferior to those presented in the stories. They make us, I hate to say this, but they make us want to be eternally children so that we can always pursue fun. But this kind of escapism is dangerous because it leads to arrested development or can lead to a corruption of our own understanding of the world. This is why Lewis so aptly connects the land of Narnia to our own world, never prioritizing Narnia or suggesting that it is a better place to be. In fact, he suggests the opposite and has the Pevensies return to England better than before. Narnia, the fairyland, is far enough away from our own world that it gives us the opportunity to question ourselves, but it's close enough that all we have to do is step through the wardrobe to get back home. This is precisely the wisdom that fairy tales provide us. By being other, they allow us to more freely question ourselves and that around us, so that we may be freed from our own peculiar hang-ups or contexts that make it difficult to pursue the virtuous life. But they are close enough to our world that we don't give up on everything around us. By loving the fairy stories, we can learn to love our world and improve it by enchanting it with the same virtues and truth we learned in the fairyland. Here's what Lewis has to say about the enduring power of fairy stories. Quote, "The fantastic or mythical is a mode available at all ages for some readers, for others at none. At all ages, if it is well used by the author and meets the right reader, it has the same power to generalize while remaining concrete, to present in palpable form, not concepts or even experiences, but the whole classes of experience, and to throw off irrelevancies. But at its best, it can do more. It can give us experiences we never had, and thus, instead of commenting on life, can add to it." Fairy stories, then, Lewis rightfully points out, are not just silly little tales that we tell to children. In fact, they are for anyone at any age. These stories enchant our world by giving us a sense of wonder, which our world rightfully deserves, but also by giving us a way to contemplate issues of right and wrong, justice and virtue, courage and deception, and much more. The truthfulness of fairy stories is exactly why they are such a great form. They deliver to us, in a delightful way, the truth that resonates deep within the heart of each person. This is why Tolkien believed in them so deeply, and why Christians for centuries have used them to help us understand the truth of God and the cosmos. Tolkien writes, "The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance, and at the same time powerfully symbolic and allegorical. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supreme convincing tone of primary art, that is creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or wrath." This point that Tolkien makes, the inner consistency of reality, is key. Fairy tales and myths are no less real than reading a history book, not because they describe what happened on such and such a day at such and such a time, but because they describe something far more important. What has happened, is happening, and will happen. Fairy stories tear apart the veil between our world and the spiritual world and allow us to glimpse, even if just for a moment, the real reality that we all desperately seek. It's the experience of Moses in the burning bush, or the disciples on Mount Tabor, those theophanies that make our faces shine because God's light is uncreated. We are unworthy to behold it, and yet mercy and grace allow us to glimpse it. Truth is far, far greater than our fleshy existence. Truth is timeless, beyond the created order, and ultimately past our own understanding. St. Maximus the Confessor describes that in order to approach God, we must lay aside even our own intellect. We have to contemplate him. Fairy stories participate in this same idea. They present creatures, places, and people completely other than us, things that cannot be understood with our own rationality, but must be approached carefully with fear and trembling, but they allow us to glimpse reality. They are different than us, difficult or even impossible to explain, but somehow allow us to understand ourselves more fully. So to conclude, fairies are real. So are ogres and goblins. Trolls do live under bridges, and sphinxes do give out riddles. There are dragons to be slain, princesses to be saved, stones to push up mountains, and cyclops who need to be blinded. Men should go out and fight the river god, and women should weave and protect Ithaca from the devious suitors. These stories and myths are full of the virtues we need to be more human. Socrates tells Alcibiades in Alcibiades 1 that the eye of the soul needs a mirror by which to see itself, so that it can truly know itself. Why does the soul need this? So that by seeing itself more clearly, it can rightly perceive its own defects. These defects are what we need to work on in order to pursue virtue, and ultimately to participate in the divine nature. This dialectical process of looking at one's soul by means of a mirror allows us to freely question ourselves and grasp at truth and goodness by means of beauty. Therefore, heed the call to adventure. Heed the warnings of the terrible dangers afoot. Read fairy stories often and use them as mirrors by which to see yourself more clearly. Thank you.
I was wondering if you might make a distinction here between you call myth as a kind of medicine. How would that be different from maybe Marx's categorization of religion, right, as an opium, right? That myth is just a kind of drug that we use to kind of soften the harshness of life's real suffering.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it was something I was sort of wrestling with, in a manner of speaking. It just sounds so insane. It's part of you just like, what? But he kind of has a point. I mean, sometimes we use stories as coping mechanisms. It's a way of trying to understand the world, but they're not necessarily real. They're just sort of like things that we come up with in order to make sense of the problems that we see. So we see bad people getting away with it, and we think, oh, there's got to be some kind of demon or whatever that is giving them great power. Or we see bad people getting punished, and we go, see, the gods are real. They punish evil people. And there's this sense in which we think of it that way. But I would contend that the fact of the matter is, if we read the ancients, from Mesopotamia all the way up to the medievals and the Renaissance, what we have is a pretty just outstanding fact that spirit exists, that the spiritual world is real. It's just statistically highly unlikely that every single human on the planet would come up with stories. Are every single story true? No, but it's not the facts. Tolkien gets at this on the fairy stories that I think is really good, and he says it better than me, so go read that after this. But he talks about that, like what these facts are, like what does it mean that these are real, is not quite as important as understanding that the reality is not just what physically is in front of me or happened, but that I can participate in what Plato would call the forms, and Aristotle probably too. Something bigger than us. So I think Marx and Nietzsche and some of those guys, I think what they're missing is their own insecurity of wrestling with how do I reckon with the fact that I have not obeyed a God, the God. How do I reckon with that? Because once you realize and you come to this in the Greek it would be called metania or metanoia, this moment of turning back and realizing, oh my gosh, what have I done? Like that is a really hard thing to deal with. Saying the stories are fake and just an opium or some kind of drug to is a I don't want to dismiss them because they're brilliant thinkers, but I do think that there's a question there that they need to wrestle with, and people who think like them, which is, what if you're wrong? And it seems like you are. Oh, no, I think you had a question.
So you mentioned that all fictional stories aren't necessarily fairy tales,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously fairy tales have some characteristics about them. Would you think that there's a method that you could use to determine whether fiction is a fairy tale, or how exactly do you differentiate between fictional stories that are fairy tales versus fictional stories that just are not fairy tales and are just fiction?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. Thank you for asking that. Yours was good too, sorry. I hate when people do that. They're like, oh, that was such a great question. You're like, well, you didn't say that to mine. Really good question. I'm going to pick on you though for a second. There isn't a method, and you should avoid wanting to use a method, because a method implies that there's just a 10-step process to victory, right? Perhaps a mode, a way of looking at it. But I think that's a really good question. And it comes down to, in my mind, I'm not an expert in this, the way Tolkien and Lewis were. So, and if you talk to literature geeks, no offense, they're like a myth and a fairy tale and a fable and a parable. These are all very, very different things. And there's these specific kind of narrative structures and things that rules that have to apply in order for it to be classified as that. And I have no problem with that. I get that. It just, for me, I'm like, when I'm reading stories to my children, it matters less to me that the difference between a fairy tale and a myth, as much as, is it communicating truth, right? Capital T. Is it participating in truth, goodness, and beauty? Is it presenting something otherworldly, but connected to our world? So not completely separated. So Homer does this by, well, one, Troy was a real place. Where it was exactly, we don't know, but it was a real place. The Greeks were real people. The Trojans were real people. But he's also talking about Zeus or Ares coming down and fighting with people. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, maybe he did. I don't know. But I'm guessing Ares didn't really come down. So then I'm like, well, then do I just dismiss Homer because he just told me a fictional story? No, because he's using these similes to constantly connect you back unconsciously. You're like, I know how waves work, right? I've been to the beach and I can see exactly what he's talking about. And then he says, and that's what the Achaeans were like. And I go, oh, that's crazy to think about. So it's got to be otherworldly, fairies, goblins, trolls, dragons, wizards, whatever. But it needs to be close enough. And there are certain stories, I don't know if you guys have read these books. If you have, I kind of feel sorry for you. What is it called? Game of Thrones? Is that what it's called? Those stories? Oh, good. Silence. It's a really great example. People tell me, oh my God, you have to read it. It's so good. Okay. My problem with it, I've never read them, and I've not watched the TV show, and I don't need to. But one of the problems with it is that it presents an alternative world. It's not connected in any way to our world. It's just its own thing. And it's also very nihilistic in many ways. He's just presenting, he took what he saw in this world, tragedy, suffering, vice, evil, and he's like, that's what life is like. So I'm going to write this alternative world where there's dragons and swords and magic, and then leave it at that. And then you can get sucked into it, and then you start putting the costumes on and going to the conventions because you love it, and you just get obsessed with it, hyper obsessive, and then you're a 57-year-old man, and it's like, what are you doing? Live your life, right? Figure out how to love those stories and connect them back to your real world. Some authors don't know how to do that. They write stories that are disconnected from our world and don't teach me to be a better person. They teach me to consume more of this product. That's the danger. So the method or mode to view those stories is hard. I mean, but I would trust Tolkien and Lewis and MacDonald, and I would trust anything written more than 200 years ago. You're probably safe. I think you were first. Go ahead.
So in stories now, in stories, you can read about good dragons and bad unicorns. Does that perception that rather than that creature's wild.
Okay, let me repeat your question, because I was supposed to do that, but then also so I understand it. So you're saying that in certain stories today, we present creatures that were, let's say, stereotypically bad, like dragons, as good. Is that a problem?
Right.
Is it warping reality? That's a great question. The answer is yes and no. No, in the sense that here's an old adage that you should always kind of keep in your back pocket. Don't tear a fence down unless you know why it was built, right? That's just good old-fashioned Southern advice that you should just remember. Don't tear a fence down if you don't know why it was built. And this is, I mean, as Catholics or Orthodox or any kind of high church religion, you understand this, that we have a tradition and we are creedally obligated to follow that tradition. Well, what is tradition? It's the fence, right? We don't just tear it down. We can't just change tradition because we want to. We don't even know how many people and years went by to make sure that this thing stayed true to what Christ gave us. So analogously, humans have been noticing that foxes are mischievous and that crows are intelligent and that monkeys are liars. If you've ever read Aesop's Fables, monkeys lie all the time. I don't know why, but they just do. And foxes are always trying to mislead you, and wolves are always trying to eat you. There's this symbology. This is kind of getting into symbology, and it's really important, I think, to be faithful to those symbols, because now I can learn to think the same way my ancestor did. And learning to think the way my ancestors did is a great joy and great gift. And to say, I don't care what my great-great-granddad thought is kind of a shame, especially because most of us don't even know what his name was and how sad that is. We don't even know where we came from anymore. And so we've basically just said, and we're never gonna try. And we just need to not do that. And one of those ways is with our stories, not like learning to do what the old masters did. You see this in art too, right? Like, I want to know how Michelangelo painted. I don't want to just paint my own way because I don't want to learn the hard discipline of rules. You know, I don't mean to sound like an old man yelling at kids on the lawn, but I just think these traditions and these rules and this understanding of symbology is very important, and we should learn to do that. However, is it corrupting the youth? You know, and should we be put to death if you write a story where a dragon is a good guy? I don't think so. I mean, probably what I would just say is that author hasn't read enough Aesop's Fables and fairy tales, and they probably need to. But I mean, I'm a boy. I think dragons are sick, and I want to ride one, you know? Like, I get it. It's kind of cool. Yeah.
So you were talking earlier about how with the difference between fiction and fairy stories is in the connection to reality. Is that on the author to make that bridge, or is it on the reader? Is it on both? Can the reader make a bridge where the author didn't intend there to be one?
Nice. That's cool to think about. Have you guys ever heard of the medieval layers of reading, the 4 layers of reading? So I always get because it's like Latin and Greek, and I get the names mixed up. But basically, there's like a literal reading of a story. There's an allegorical reading of the story. There is an anagogical reading of the story, and there's one more. Anyways, these layers are intended. They came out of Scripture, of reading Scripture and how to interpret Scripture. So you can read it kind of literally, what happened in the narrative. And then there's the allegory. Well, what do these people represent, right? So the burning bush is also a burning bush, but it also represents the Theotokos, Virgin Mary. Then there's a sort of a more anagogical one, which is, well, what is the story of Moses going up to the mountain? Teach me about my salvation and what heaven is going to be like. You know, and so these different ways of reading. What I mean to say by that is that it is the responsibility of the author to write things well. You have a responsibility. Don't call yourself an author if you're going to purposely write bad stuff. And the best writing in the world can be subjected to those 4 layers of reading with great scrutiny and shine. So Homer shines, Scripture shines, Shakespeare shines, That's why we have what are called the great books, because these books just shone throughout time, because they could be subjected to all kinds of reading and interpretation, and you could realize that there's so much to glean there. Did the author intend all of that? I don't know. I mean, there's a reason that Homer begins both the Iliad and Odyssey by saying, "Sing, O Muse." It's not my words, it's the goddesses, right? And then in the Holy Scriptures, we believe the same thing, that their spirit, the Holy Spirit came down and inspired these authors to write some of the greatest living works of all time. So there's a sense in which they could probably that the reader could make connections that the author didn't intend. And we'll never know because the author's dead and has been for thousands of years. Thank God, right? That way they can't mess around with it, like some authors are doing with their works today. Don't mess around with it. You tried to write a good product and you tried to write something that participated in truth and can lead me to truth. Let's let the Holy Spirit work. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier how some stories of today can lead to escapism, which can make you want to be more of a child. Do you mean childish or childlike? And can you elaborate a little bit on how the stories of today do make you want to be that?
That is something I should put in this talk. Thank you so much. What a beautiful thing. Childish versus childlike, right? Because Christ says, become childlike. Come to me as little children. And my wife said, you need to put that in your talk. And I forgot. So thank you. Yes, that is a beautiful point. Right. Being childish is the problem. Fairy stories, if they're done well and done rightly, make us more childlike, where we wonder at the world. And my son, he's almost a year old now, he's just sit in the backyard and pick up rocks and just look at them and throw them down forever. What? What kind of mind is that? Because I, get bored in my house. I can get bored at a museum, but children can wonder at yards forever. So I'm guessing that Christ meant something like that. He wants us to wonder always, The Mass never gets boring, right? Even though it can be sometimes. But that's on us. That's not the problem there. So beautiful point. That's exactly right. I think childishness results from a lot of childish authors today writing childish things for wannabe children who are upset that they had to grow up. And they don't want to be grown up. They want to be able to have no responsibility and still play and shoot laser guns and do those things. And none of those things are bad for children, but at a certain point, you have to realize that I can't do these things anymore. I have to now make space for my children to enjoy that. But if I decide to be the child forever, my children will never get to live that life. So I need childlike wonder forever. I need childishness for a season. Yes?
I'm teaching a class on short fiction. I'm actually a faculty member here.
Okay.
So I was just kind of sneaking into this.
Thank you. I'm honored.
But I almost wasn't part of this. Invited myself and some of the students in my class, and we have read The Little Mermaid.
Oh, nice.
Hans Christian Andersen. And I think that what you're talking about can be illustrated so easily by the Hollywood version, which cuts out precisely what is in good fairy tales, which is real cross, real suffering, and transcendence of that. So how you say it starts with happiness, it ends with happiness. It doesn't exclude the Golgotha, the suffering, the self-sacrifice.
Right.
It doesn't eliminate the cross. Hollywood does, and it reads lies. Falsehood. It becomes part of simulacrum. It simulates what fairy tales don't. Fairy tales do not take you away from life. They get you back to life. They help you to grow up and become childlike as adults, as mature and responsible, caring and loving, functional adults. Hollywood breeds childishness that results in dysfunction, immorality, and just decline of culture and tradition altogether. Right? So compare the version of The Little Mermaid that Hollywood propagates and The Little Mermaid, which actually was literally the statue of Little Mermaid, was taken to Shanghai to represent the ideal city for the future. And they said any ideal city of the future doesn't just have to have infrastructure, it has to have magic. And they be there at the exhibit, because no city that is human can be without magic.
Yes.
And that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you so much. Heed her warning. That is exactly right. Yes. Suffering. Crosses and crowns, right? We need both. Crosses and crowns. That's really, really good. Any last questions? One more? I'm to let him go, yeah.
What translation of the Iliad was that?
So this is actually, I pulled it online. It's a guy named John Hunston, I believe. He was just doing a little expose on Homeric similes, so he just translated them himself.
Oh, okay.
But typically I would read the Lattimore. Peter Green, he just died this past year. He's also a very good author. He's a newer translation as well. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking.
Thank you all.